From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
I will give you $1 million to your favorite charity, paid for by Trump, if you take the test and it shows you're an Indian, you know.
After years of mocking by Donald Trump, Senator Elizabeth Warren releases a DNA test showing Native American ancestry.
Trump can say whatever he wants about me, but mocking Native Americans or any group in order to try to get at me, that's not what America stands for.
We'll speak with the Boston Globe's Annie Linsky, who examined hundreds of documents to determine ethnicity was not a factor in Elizabeth Warren's rise in law. But many Native Americans are criticizing Senator Warren's use of a DNA test to prove Native American lineage. We'll host a roundtable discussion with Ojibwe lawyer Tara Hauska, Indian Country Today editor Mark Trahant, and Jossie Ross, an author and member of the Blackfeet Nation. And we'll look at the record number of Native American women running for office in the midterm elections. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The United States received a $100 million payment from Saudi Arabia Tuesday, the same day Secretary of State Mike Pompeo met with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and his father, King Salman, in Saudi Arabia to discuss the disappearance of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. While the $100 million payment had been brokered earlier this summer and is related to U.S. military efforts in Syria, the timing of its delivery appeared highly suspicious, with one U.S. official telling the New York Times, quote, "The timing of this is no coincidence." Turkish officials have said Khashoggi was tortured and murdered by a squad of 15 Saudi hitmen who dismembered his body. Video and audio recordings from inside the consulate reportedly show Khashoggi was beaten, tortured, and beheaded with his fingers cut off, his body dismembered. This is Secretary of State Mike Pompeo speaking about his visit to Saudi Arabia on the tarmac in Riyadh.
They made no exceptions to who they would hold accountable. They were very clear. They understand the importance of this issue. They're determined to get to the bottom of it, and that they will conduct the report, and we'll all get a chance to see it. They each promised that they would achieve that for us.
Did they say that Mr. Khashoggi is alive or dead?
I don't want to talk about any of the facts. They didn't want to either, in that they want to have the opportunity to complete this investigation in a thorough way.
Khashoggi's suspected murder has caused a diplomatic crisis between the United States and Saudi Arabia, particularly for Trump's senior advisor and son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who has close ties to Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. This is Kushner refusing to answer a CBS reporter's questions on a flight on Tuesday.
Anyway, Jared, Carol Burnett with CBS. Any comment on... I don't give a thing. It's a time.
Service later had to defend the service for how its agents handled the incident, saying they did not intend to impede media access. Kushner has cultivated an extremely close relationship with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, dining with him in Washington and Riyadh and hosting one-on-one phone calls with him outside of normal diplomatic channels. The death toll from Category 4 Hurricane Michael has risen to 29 people as search and rescue efforts continue a week after the devastating storm flattened parts of the Florida Panhandle. As many as 160,000 homes and businesses across the southeast United States still have no power. Over 1,000 people are still living in emergency shelters. Hurricane Michael was one of the most powerful storms ever to strike the U.S. mainland. Meteorologists say it was supercharged by warmer than usual water in the Gulf of Mexico. In economic news, President Trump's asking federal departments to slash 5% from their budgets amidst the swelling national deficit. The military could see a smaller cut, going from $716 billion to $700 billion, a decrease of only 2.3% from the current budget, which is the largest defense authorization in history. In response to Trump's plan, former Deputy Secretary of Labor Christopher Liu tweeted, "That's a 5% cut for veterans, national security, law enforcement, health care, healthcare, farmers, roads, bridges, workers, environment, food and housing aid, everything. And it would still only amount to $60 billion a year, a fraction of the $1.5 trillion Trump GOP tax cut, he tweeted. Canada became the second country in the world after Uruguay to legalize recreational marijuana Wednesday. The Canadian government says it will also move to pardon people who've previously been convicted of low-level marijuana possession. U.S. Customs and Border Protection says the new law in Canada will not affect existing marijuana laws in the U.S. and that anyone crossing the border could face marijuana-related questioning. Canadians who receive pardons for marijuana-related offenses could also be deemed inadmissible to enter into the United States. In Crimea, a gunman killed 19 and wounded dozens more at a university in the Russian-annexed territory Wednesday. Authorities say the shooter was an 18-year-old student from the school who attacked his classmates before killing himself. The attack is the deadliest instance of school violence in the region since the 2004 Beslan terror attack, which killed 333 people, most of them children. This is a school administrator speaking after the attack.
There were many bodies, children's bodies. It was a real act of terrorism. They burst inside the college, right? 5 or 10 minutes after I left, someone burst inside and blew everything up. All the windows blew out. They blew up the hall. Then they were running around and throwing some explosive packages. Then they were running around and holding guns. I don't know exactly what weaponry. On the second floor, they were opening classes and were killing everyone whom they managed to find, whom they saw. Everyone is ours. It's a real terror act, just like Beslan.
CNN is reporting based on satellite imagery Russia's building up its military installations in Kaliningrad, a key Russian enclave on the Baltic Sea. The reported military buildup is part of growing tensions between Russia and NATO. This comes after reports earlier this year that Russia had upgraded a nuclear weapons storage facility in Kaliningrad. The Israeli military bombed the Gaza Strip Wednesday, killing at least one Palestinian man, injuring over a dozen more people. Gaza's health ministry says the Israeli air raids killed 25-year-old Naji Ahmad al-Zanin and injured at least 6 children as they were on their way to school in central Gaza. Israel claims the bombing campaign was in retaliation for a rocket allegedly fired from Gaza into Israel, which struck a home, causing no injuries. In Ethiopia, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed unveiled his new cabinet Tuesday, appointing women to a record 50% of positions. Ethiopia now becomes one of the first African nations and one of the only few countries worldwide with gender parity in ministerial positions. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, an estimated 200,000 people are returning to the southern Kasai region after being expelled from neighboring Angola. Congolese officials and migrants say dozens have been killed this month as part of the forced migration. Meanwhile, in the northeastern part of the DRC, an outbreak of Ebola has killed at least 24 people over the last week. Back in the U.S., the Police Accountability Office in the city of Chicago has released footage of off-duty police officer Khalil Muhammad shooting unarmed African-American teenager Ricardo Hayes last year. The video directly contradicts Officer Muhammad's claim that the shooting followed an escalated encounter and appeared to be pulling out a gun, instead showing the officer chasing after Hayes in his car before shooting directly at him as he appeared to calmly take a few steps toward the vehicle with his arms by his side. Hayes has autism, adding to recent questions over police handling of people with mental and developmental disabilities. Muhammad is currently on administrative leave while the incident is being investigated. The Justice Department conducted an investigation into the Chicago Police Department after the shooting and killing of unarmed African-American teenager Laquan McDonald that showed that Chicago police are 14 times more likely to use force against young black men than white men. In more police violence news, the family of Chinedu Okobi, a black Bay Area man who was killed by police after being tasered, is demanding answers. 36-year-old Okobi was killed on October 3rd in San Mateo County, California, after he reportedly disrupted traffic, resulting in a deadly encounter with a police officer. But details about the killing remain unknown. Okobi's family said he suffered from mental illness. A Prince George's County, Maryland police officer appeared in court Wednesday after being charged with raping a woman during a traffic stop October 11th. The woman says she believes Officer Ryan Macklin attacked her after he learned she's undocumented. A Pennsylvania Catholic priest pleaded guilty on Wednesday to sexually abusing 2 boys. Prosecutors say Reverend David Lee Paulson sexually abused an altar boy in the church and made him confess afterward, as well as assaulting him and attempting to assault another boy at hunting camp. Paulson was arrested and charged in May following the explosive Pennsylvania grand jury investigation into systematic, widespread sexual abuse in the church. Former USA Gymnastics president Steve Penny has been arrested on charges of tampering with evidence in the case of Larry Nassar, the former USA Gymnastics doctor who's been convicted of sexually abusing hundreds of women and girls. Penny is accused of removing documents linked to the case from the USA Gymnastics National Team Training Center. If convicted, he could face up to 10 years in prison. And in Georgia, a bus carrying African-American senior citizens to a polling place in Jefferson County was stopped Monday. All passengers told to get off after a county clerk raised concerns about the bus and the organizers' political motivations. The bus trip was organized by the nonpartisan group Black Voters Matter. The senior citizens were on their way to cast their ballots on the first day of early voting in Georgia. This is co-founder Cliff Albright in a video released by Black Voters Matter.
Somebody called the commission, the county commission, to complain because they saw all these black folks get on this big black bus. It's the blackest bus in America. Somebody drove past, saw that, got nervous, got mad, called the county commission's office, which then called the center. And the bottom line was all the folks who had just got on the bus. And the bus was full. This is a 50-passenger bus full of folk had to come off the bus.
This comes as Georgia's Democratic gubernatorial candidate Stacey Abrams is calling for her Republican opponent, Brian Kemp, to step down as Secretary of State following allegations of widespread voter suppression. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. The midterm elections are less than 3 weeks away, but 2 of the top contenders for the 2020 presidential election are already sparring on the national stage after Senator Elizabeth Warren released a DNA test Monday showing Native American ancestry. The announcement responded directly to President Trump, who's frequently attacked Senator Warren by calling her Pocahontas. Senator Warren has said she will consider a 2020 presidential run after the midterms.
A Stanford professor of genetics says there's strong evidence of Native American lineage in Warren's family tree dating back 6 to 10 generations. This is Dr. Carlos Bustamante speaking in a video released by Senator Warren Monday when she released her DNA test.
In the senator's genome, we did find 5 segments of Native American ancestry with very high confidence, where we believe the error rate is less than 1 in 1,000.
Now, the president likes to call my mom a liar. What do the facts say?
The facts suggest that you absolutely have a Native American ancestor in your pedigree.
I'm not enrolled in a tribe, and only tribes determine tribal citizenship. I understand and respect that distinction, but my family history is my family history.
That was Senator Elizabeth Warren, who has said her mother told her she was part Cherokee and part Delaware. At multiple points in her career, Warren identified as Native American, but in the video she released Monday, her former colleagues say she never claimed Native American ancestry when applying for jobs to gain benefit.
Do you remember her heritage ever coming up during the hiring process?
No. Her heritage had no bearing on her hiring, period.
I was chairing the committee that year. If ethnicity had been part of the discussion, I would have known about it.
Her name with respect to racial minority hires, no, never.
At a July 5th rally in Montana, Donald Trump offered to donate $1 million to Senator Warren's favorite charity if a DNA test proved her claims of Native American ancestry.
I will give you $1 million to your favorite charity, paid for by Trump, if you take the test that it shows you're an Indian,
But following the release of Warren's DNA test Monday, Trump denied that he'd ever made these claims.
No, I have no. Who cares? Who cares? I didn't say that. I didn't. You better read it again.
Well, for more, we go to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by Annie Linsky, Deputy Bureau Chief for the Boston Globe. She examined hundreds of documents to determine that, quote, ethnicity is not a factor in Elizabeth Warren's rise in law. Annie Linsky, welcome to Democracy Now! You did an extensive investigation. Can you talk about what led up to the Senator Warren's release of the video and the DNA test on Monday? But first, talk about what you found, all the people that you interviewed, what the allegations are, and what people said to you.
Hi there. Sure. Happy to. So, at the Boston Globe, we had been asking for years, for 6 years, really, for Elizabeth Warren to release her personnel records, really from Harvard and the University of Pennsylvania, where she'd been a law professor. And the reason that we were so eager to look at these files is there's been this long-running allegation against her that she checked the box and used her Native American history as a reason to get ahead. And so that's always been the allegation. And the reason for it is back, I think it was in 87, when she was at the University of Texas as a professor, she started calling herself a minority, listing herself as a minority in this a law directory. And the very next year, she gets this really big job as a law professor at an Ivy League institution. And so the idea was, oh, my goodness, the moment she identifies herself as a minority professionally, that's when this big promotion comes. And then a few years later, she goes on to an even bigger institution, to Harvard. So we went back and we looked at as many documents as we could find, and to find out, I mean, was there some correlation there? Because on the face of it, it looks like there could be. But when you look at, starting with the University of Pennsylvania, we were able to find a document that had never before been reported. It was a 10-page equal opportunity memo that the University of Pennsylvania had to fill out when they hired Warren. And they had to fill it out because they saw themselves as hiring a white woman. And so they had to, in the course of 10 pages, go through this giant pool of applicants that they had looked at for this position, break them down by sex, by minority, the number of Black applicants, the number of Asian applicants, the number of Native American applicants, and then say, look, after looking at all of these people, we ended up hiring a white woman, Elizabeth Warren, because we could not find an equal or better minority for the job. And that's quoted in the report. And so to me, that pretty much solved the issue for University of Pennsylvania. Clearly, she was not a minority hire if the hiring committee there was having to argue to hire her as a white woman. So that then takes you to Harvard. After a few years at Penn, she teaches at Harvard in '93 as a visiting professor, which is a sort of weird thing that law schools do. They have you come and when they're looking at hiring you, and you have like this year-long job interview. So she taught for a year at Harvard, and they loved her, and they did an unusual thing, which is offer her a job, while she was still there and still teaching in '93. And she initially turned that job down. She wasn't really gunning for it. There were a number of reasons, but she turned it down. But at Harvard, you really wanted to see, is there a similar form? Is there a similar EEOC form that Harvard had to fill out? And if there was one, I couldn't find it. So to look at Harvard and understand, did they hire her because of her Native American heritage, I instead had to look at this vast hiring committee. And the way it works at Harvard is tenured law professors get to vote on who can join their staff, kind of who can join the club. And they have these two meetings about Elizabeth Warren and sort of picking apart her scholarship, trying to figure out, do we want this woman on our staff? And so I tracked down every single living person who would have been in that meeting and tried to interview all of them to see if I could find anybody who said, yeah, we saw her, she was Native American, and we wanted a Native American on the staff. And of the ones I was able to talk to, most of them said they had no idea that she had this Native American heritage. And there was only one person who said, yeah, this might have come up, but it's not why we hired her. We did not see her as an affirmative action hire. So the professors who hired her were fairly clear on this. The other thing that was really interesting is I talked to some of the students, because at Harvard at the time was just lily white. I mean, there were, I think, 4 or 5 black professors, and that was essentially it in terms of Harvard Law School staff. And the students at the time were really agitating for more diversity in faculty. And so there were protests outside of the meeting where Warren was hired, and students were very pleased at the end of the day when word came out that they had hired Elizabeth Warren, a woman. But the students who were interviewed at the time by the Harvard Crimson said they were upset that it was a white woman. Why not hire, a black woman or a Asian woman or a Hispanic woman? This was the debate that was going on the campus, and the student activists who were most attuned to it, yes, they were pleased that there was a little bit more gender diversity with Warren's hire, but they were still angry that a woman of color hadn't been hired. So, I mean, to me, that also says, if she was pushing this as a reason to get hired, she definitely wasn't doing a very good job.
Well, Annie, thank you. If you could just say again, just to clarify, the exact years and institutions in which Elizabeth Warren identified herself as Native Americans, because as you know, her critics point out that if she didn't do it to advance herself professionally, why did she do it at all? And that, even if her family was speaking to her about her heritage, what reason did she have in the moment that she decided to declare that on official documents?
Yeah, this is where it gets complicated for Warren. So if you sort of take if you accept that she did not get ahead because of this, the question though is, when she was at the University of Pennsylvania from, I believe it was 87 to 95, I might be a little wrong on that. When she was there 2 years, 2 years after being hired as a white woman at the University of Pennsylvania, she does something very unusual, which is she has her ethnicity code changed in the University of Pennsylvania's HR system. That does something for the University of Pennsylvania. It allows them to report that they have a more diverse faculty than they have. And the University of Pennsylvania, like all major institutions, was under pressure to hire diverse faculties. So she does this for some reason. She does the same thing at Harvard. So when she's later hired at Harvard, of course, your HR forms don't transfer from one university to the next. She has to refill them all out. And about 2 years after she got the job offer at Harvard and a good 3 or 4 months after she started working at Harvard in 95, I also saw documentary evidence that her ethnicity code changes to Native American. And that's when Harvard starts reporting to the federal government that they have a Native American law professor on staff. So in both instances, she did proactively make a change. And that change was used by these two institutions to argue, hey, look, we're not as bad as it may seem diversity-wise because we do have this professor who's Native American. So that's certainly complicated for her. I asked her about that, and I don't have a satisfying answer from her about why she did it. I mean, she says to this day she does not specifically remember making those changes. And she says that she's thought back to that time in her life, that her the matriarchs of her family, her mother and her mother's sisters were getting older, and they were starting to talk more about family heritage, and they were dying. And so what she's saying to me is that she kind of felt this sense that this sort of growing pride in her roots. And at the same time, if you think about her life, she grew up in Oklahoma. She went to graduated from school in Texas. And now all of a sudden she's sort of thrust for the first time in this Ivy League environment, and her sort of character is to sort of double down on who she is, rather than kind of try to fit in at these institutions. So I think that's part of it. I mean, I talked to people at the University of Pennsylvania who would say that she liked to identify as an Okie and would use that word a lot. And so, her explanation really is that this was sort of an expression of the identity that she was trying to put out in the world. But, I think it's a fair criticism when you look at how these universities were using that statistic, and particularly Harvard, which was so completely lily white at the time. Harvard was arguing that, hey, look, we have a diverse staff because we have, as it turns out, this woman, Elizabeth Warren, who's Native American.
So let me go back to an old Harvard Crimson, the University Paper article.
Yeah.
A law school spokesman tells the Harvard Crimson in 1996, of 71 current law school professors and assistant professors, 11 are women, 5 are black, 1 is Native American, and 1 is Hispanic. Yeah. That's with Elizabeth Warren being that one Native American. A Crimson editorial from 1998 refers to Warren as the law school's one tenured minority woman. Politico also reports that a 97 Fordham Law Review piece described her as Harvard Law School's first woman of color. Annie Linsky.
Yeah, I mean, that's a problem. That is a problem that that Harvard had, in that they were willing to go out and tout Elizabeth Warren as their woman of color. And if you, the context at the time is really interesting. It's, I mean, Harvard in 1993, when Elizabeth Warren was hired, had not hired a single woman of color to their faculty. They had not hired a single person. There was, in Harvard's 200-year history, no woman of color was hired. And that didn't change until, I believe, 97 or 98. But I will say, when they did make their finally they hired an African-American woman, Harvard did make an enormous deal about it. But I think that this is where this problem comes, is Harvard was out there touting her as Native American. I will say the University of Pennsylvania took a very different approach. I talked to the dean there and about this, and he was like, no, we were not going to do that. If Elizabeth Warren wanted to be Native American on our rolls, on our statistics, that's fine. But there was no way we were going to walk out and suggest that she was a Native American law professor. So the two universities took a very different approach.
But Annie, a lot of her critics, the critics of her decision to come out as Native Americans, say that she basically, her presence at these universities sanctioned the universities, allowed them to not hire other Native Americans because they had one. Is that true? Is that what you learned?
I think that's where it gets problematic for her. I mean, that has not been a criticism that's been leveled. I think when she's going into a Democratic primary with, Cory Booker, with Kamala Harris, and with a very diverse electorate in the Democratic Party, she's going to have a very good answer for that. When I asked her that very question, she says that she was doing a lot of work to promote women and to promote minority hires. But I think that is where it becomes more problematic for her, because her allowing Harvard in particular to use this ethnicity claim, if you look at the statistics, they were arguing internally, we're doing much better with minority status than our own measurements want us to be doing. And so sort of internally they were saying, we're doing fine. Externally, Harvard was still saying we need to do better for the most part. So, yeah, I mean, I think that is an area that's going to be really complicated.
Finally, Annie Linsky, you've been speaking to Senator Warren after she released the DNA test and the video. You've spoken to her husband, Bruce Mann, about the effects of what this has meant. And you've covered the response to the release of the DNA test. I have. And this has been a fascinating few days, really. It was a big surprise, I think, to many people that Elizabeth Warren was willing to kind of undergo this DNA test and do it and put the results out there. I think it's a little early to know what the
impact of it's going to be on her political future. But I also think, she has been harangued and questioned on this for more than a year. And her approach to this is quite different than, say, Hillary Clinton. Her idea is like, look, I took this test. Look, it does actually show that this is the first proof that she has been able to produce that her family stories were true and that there was Native American ancestry in her family. So, this is the first time in 6 years that there's been something beyond, a family lore to rely on for this claim. Although, for critics, they're saying, my goodness, it's so far, 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 far back. Does it really count? And so people will have to make that decision for themselves. I know that this is one of those questions. Every time I write about Elizabeth Warren, I would get so many emails about, why doesn't she just take a DNA test? They would be from across the board. It didn't feel like the sort of normal, operative generated type of emails. They would just be from regular people. I got so many from one story, I actually had to create like a form email to respond to them all. So my guess is that she was getting a similar amount of questions from her constituents. And I guess this is the way that she decided to deal with it, which is very different from how a lot of candidates would. And we'll see whether it was wise or not.
Well, Annie, it seems very quickly that she has, maybe for other reasons, expressed regret about her decision on taking the DNA test and releasing it, saying, I wish I had been more mindful of the distinction between heritage and tribal citizenship. Is it your sense that she has been regretful for this reason?
No. I don't think she regrets doing the same. I have no indication that's the case at all. I think what she regrets is, my sense would be that she regrets calling herself Native American at Harvard and at Penn. I think that's where she's learned a lot more about ethnicity and about how tribal membership works and how a family story is not the same as having the experience of being a member of a tribe. But, the idea that she regrets doing the DNA test, I have not heard that from anyone.
Annie Linsky, I want to thank you for being with us. Washington, D.C., Deputy Bureau Chief for the Boston Globe. We'll link to your piece. Ethnicity is not a factor in Elizabeth Warren's rise in law. After break, we host a roundtable discussion with Ojibwe lawyer Tara Hauska, Indian Country Today editor Mark Trahant, and Jassy Ross, an author and member of Blackfeet Nation. This is Democracy Now! Back with them in a moment. Light by a Tribe Called Red, featuring Lito Pimiento. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We continue to look at Senator Elizabeth Warren's claims to Native American ancestry. She's come under fire since releasing a DNA test showing Native American lineage in her family tree. In a video released Monday, she told her family's story.
My mother was born in eastern Oklahoma. It had been Indian territory until just a few years earlier when it had become a state. My daddy always said he fell head over heels in love with my mother the first time he saw her. But my daddy's parents, the Herrings, were bitterly opposed to their marrying because my mother's family, the Reeds, was part Native American. This sort of discrimination was common at the time. So when my mama was 19 and my daddy was 20, they eloped. And together they built a family, my 3 older brothers and me.
Elizabeth Warren has said her mother told her family had ties to the Cherokee and Delaware tribes. But Native Americans across the country are criticizing Warren's decision to use a DNA test to assert her heritage. Jack Hoskin Jr., Secretary of State for the Cherokee Nation, said, quote, sovereign tribal nations set their own legal requirements for citizenship, and while DNA tests can be used to determine lineage, such as paternity to an individual, it is not evidence for tribal affiliation. Using a DNA test to lay claim to any connection to the Cherokee Nation or any tribal nation, even vaguely, is inappropriate and wrong.
For more, we host a roundtable discussion. Joining us from Fargo, North Dakota is Tara Hauska, National Campaign Director for Honor the Earth. She's an Ojibwe lawyer. And we go to Anchorage, Alaska, where we're joined by Mark Trahant, who is editor of Indian Country Today, a member of the Shoshone-Bannock tribes. In Seattle, Washington, we're joined by Jossie Ross, author, speaker, lawyer, and storyteller, member of the Blackfeet Nation, host of the podcast Breakdances with Wolves. We welcome you all to Democracy Now! Let's go to North Dakota, to Tara Hauska. If you can respond first to Senator Warren releasing her DNA test indicating Native American lineage and her video, and your thoughts on this.
What I see are some non-Native folks arguing over what Native identity is, and Native people just being almost entirely left out of the conversation. So we saw that Lindsey Graham now is running around saying, you know, that I have more Indian blood than she does. I should open a casino. It kind of shows just how problematic Senator Warren's decision to use this DNA test as her smoking gun. Now, see, I'm Native. I said I was. When in fact, you know, common genetic markers and geographic location does not tell you anything about, you know, which tribe you might be a part of or that you might have descendancy from. She couldn't actually locate an ancestor, having done a genealogy study, who is a Native person. It's kind of this one-drop rule that she's reinforcing all these, you know, understandings of race being something by blood and there being this difference between different ethnicities.
Let's go to Senator Warren in her own words in that video that she released on Monday talking about her Native American heritage.
I'm not enrolled in a tribe, and only tribes determine tribal citizenship. I understand and respect that distinction, but my family history is my family history.
So that's Elizabeth Warren. Tara, can you respond to that and also explain how is it that Native American tribes determine membership?
Yeah, you know, I think she's kind of walking back her words because she got this really harsh statement by Cherokee Nation, who is saying, you know, that this is really disrespectful and has nothing to do with, you know, their sovereign right to determine membership. You know, I don't think that she's very regretful about this. I think that she's just kind of bowled her way forward on this issue. And, you know, yeah, it's a sovereign right of tribal nations to determine who is a member. It is, you know, relationships of kinship, of community, of, you know, a lived experience. It's all kinds of different factors that sometimes can include blood quantum, but blood quantum is something that was created by the colonial government, not by tribal nations. And it's this kind of myth that's been perpetuated by the United States and by many, many Americans who claim to be, quote unquote, part Cherokee, you know, and continue these problematic ideas of who Native people are and were.
Let's turn to Republican Senator Lindsey Graham on Fox and Friends Tuesday, saying he plans to take a DNA test in response to Senator Warren.
I'm going to take a DNA test. All of you have. I've been told that my grandmother was part Cherokee and Indian. It may all be just talk, but you're going to find out in a couple of weeks because I'm going to take this test.
You are going to take it.
I'm taking it, and the results are going to be revealed here. This is my Trump moment. This is reality TV. I'm dying to know. Because I'm dying. You know, I didn't really think much about it, but she's less than 1/10 of 1%. I think I can beat her. I think I can beat her.
Right, and if you do beat her, will you ask for $1 million from the president, too?
No, I want a casino and $1 million.
I want a casino and $1 million, Tara Hauska. That was Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina.
Yeah, it's incredibly disrespectful and, you know, just really shows how Warren's behavior, although it's less crude than some of the comments who've been made by Donald Trump about, you know, Pocahontas and demeaning women into this, you know, historic figure and making that into somehow a slur. her behavior is less crude, but it's still problematic, and it's still a complete misunderstanding of what Native identity actually is, and it perpetuates this myth that so many people hold. I mean, you live on the East Coast and you hear almost everyone having this story of being part Cherokee on their mother's side, when there are real Cherokee people who still live today. And we should respect that and understand who Native people really are.
Well, I'd like to bring in Mark Trahant from Anchorage, Alaska. Could you also comment on this controversy? You've been extremely critical of the fact that Elizabeth Warren has taken a DNA test and released it. Could you explain what your problem with this is, your criticism?
Well, the DNA test itself is just another use of a colonial narrative, basically. The ultimate goal of a DNA test is to prove that Indians are immigrants like everybody else. And it's, again, it takes away from the idea that there's a tribal community with a governing institution that's been around before the United States. And there are reasons that tribes are around with 10,000-year histories in North America.
Well, Mark, can you explain what you mean by that? The DNA tests are there to prove that Indigenous people, Native Americans, are immigrants like everyone else. Why?
Kim Tallbear, who's written quite a bit about this, has talked about that it's basically coming up with a narrative that says figure out where folks came from originally and trying to figure that out rather than to connect with the stories. I mean, Shoshone Bannock, for example, one of the things that just I love about my own people is that if you look at the history of North America, we once hunted mastodon. And you think about that as an arc of history that goes back many generations that is much deeper than a test that you can use.
And you even suggested, Mark, that her releasing her DNA test kind of disqualifies her to be president. Could you explain that?
Sure. I mean, campaigns are about stories and what story you're going to tell about yourself. And here we are less than 3 weeks away from an extraordinary election, and we're talking about this instead of the extraordinary election. I think just from a strategic point of view, that makes no sense.
Let's go to Josie Ross in Seattle, author, lawyer, member of the Blackfeet Nation. As you watch this from the Northwest, Josie, talk about your response, not only to Senator Warren doing the DNA test in all the ways she has variously represented herself, but also Donald Trump and his comments about her continually right through this week talking about Pocahontas.
Thank you, and good morning. Thank you for having all of us. It's good to be on this very esteemed panel. You know, I had a few reactions. Number one is one concerning the media generally, and it would be nice to have quote unquote Native stories, Native themed stories that weren't centered on white people. That's something that's very common, whether you're talking about Hollywood, Dances with Wolves, Little Big Man, Elizabeth Warren. Every single time we see Natives in mass media, it's in response to white people doing something really, really stupid or saving our communities. And that's a false narrative. And so it would be nice to, you know, see our communities that are actually pushing for an amazing recovery, relationship to economics and relationship to education and relationship to language, actually have that centered around a story as opposed to around a white person and the Native people being collateral to that white person. Also, a reaction is that, you know, Elizabeth Warren, obviously, she wants to be an ally, but she doesn't want to be an accomplice, meaning that she's still willing to make Native people political fodder for her own political survival. As Mark pointed out, you have Native women that are running historic numbers and doing historic things in this particular 2018 election. Sharice Davids in Kansas, Deb Haaland in New Mexico, Paulette Jordan running for governor of Idaho. But yet, with all of these amazing Native women's stories, this white woman wants to center this Indian narrative, this Native narrative in politics around her, as opposed to going out and campaigning for them 2 weeks in advance of the 2018 elections. And excuse me, and to me, that does make me question her judgment we definitely rightfully, condemn Donald Trump for his emotionality and his tempestuousness and unpredictability, but she does a Maury Povich-like spectacle revealing her DNA results as opposed to doing the actual work of a leader.
You mentioned Jassy Deb Howland. I want to turn to what she said, the Democratic candidate for Congress in New Mexico, who could become the first Native woman to serve in Congress. She tweeted this week, Senator Elizabeth Warren's DNA test confirms the family history she has long shared with the world, and I acknowledge her Native ancestry as testament to who we are as Americans. The oppression that Native people have experienced over the course of our history caused many Native American families to deny their heritage, language, and culture, and I understand why this was the case with her family. Senator Warren has been a sister in the struggle for years for Indigenous people's rights, and for all of us who weren't born into the top 1%, the revelation of Senator Warren's Native American ancestry is significant for her personally, and I join her in celebrating her ancestry. That is the quote of the Native American congressional candidate, Democratic candidate in New Mexico, who could well become the first Native American Congress member. Your response to what she says, Jassy? Yeah. Congresswoman. She'd be the first Congresswoman.
And I believe that her and Sharice Davids will co-occupy that title as the first Native Congress people in the House. And that's going to be an amazing celebration and wonderful event for United States politics and United States history generally. But for Congresswoman Howland, that is a typically gracious and amazingly brilliant response. And absolutely, I'm sure she does celebrate, just like all of us. Cool. If you want to be into the fold socially, that's a beautiful thing. You want to find out why, this is the year of the Native woman. And, Elizabeth Warren evidently wanted to upgrade herself, Beyonce style. But that doesn't mean that it requires these Maury Povich-like theatrics in which they do it and disrupt a flow where Native women are rightfully getting a lot of attention politically and a lot of resources politically and do this as opposed to doing the work. It's an incredibly gracious and generous response from Congresswoman Howland. But that doesn't mean that the timing is correct, number one, nor that it wasn't something that, that she necessarily thought out or her people thought out properly.
And your response to Trump saying he'll give her $1 million if she takes a DNA test and now saying, I never said anything like that?
Trump's a pig. I mean, he's a liar. So that shouldn't surprise us. I think both of them for making Native ancestry into a spectacle, into a three-ring circus in which non-natives, and specifically white people, by the way, feel completely emboldened to posit their opinions and actually challenge Native people about Native ancestry. Elizabeth Warren and Donald Trump both opened that door. And so I believe that both of them should donate $1 million to the National Indian Women's Resource Center. And, because both of them helped create this spectacle and both of them have an obligation to Native women, I believe.
We're going to break and then come back to this discussion. We're talking to Jassy Ross, author, lawyer, member of Blackfeet Nation, speaking to us from Seattle, Washington. Tara Houska with Honor the Earth, Ojibwe lawyer, speaking to us from Fargo, North Dakota. And Mark Trahant, Indian editor of Indian Country Today, speaking to us from Anchorage, Alaska. This is Democracy Now! Back in a minute.
Jimmy Blacksmith, don't you know how it's gonna end? With a bullet in your back, are you swinging from a rope's end? For the honor of your people you did defend. Oh, Jimmy Blacksmith, did you know it's gotta hurt to be ripped up and bullied for your whole life's work? And now it's time for you to take back your punch of dirt. Oh, Jimmy Blacksmith, what have you done? You murdered 7 people with your Jimmy Blacksmith, what have you done? You murdered 7 people, now the auxiliary got you on the run. Well, I don't pretend to have any
The chant of Jimmy Blacksmith by the Groovesmiths. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We end today's show looking at the record number of Native American women running for office in the midterm elections. There has never been a Native American woman Congress member. This year, there are at least 4 Indigenous women running for Congress, 3 are running for governor, and 31 are running for seats in the state legislature.
Still with us, Mark Trahant, editor of Indian Country Today, member of the Shoshone-Bannock tribes. Also with us in Fargo, North Dakota, Tara Houska, National Campaign Director for Honor the Earth, Ojibwe from the Cochiching First Nation. In Seattle, Washington, we're joined by Jossie Ross, author, speaker, lawyer, storyteller, member of Blackfeet Nation, host of the podcast Breakdances with Wolves. Mark, let's go to you in Alaska. You've been writing a lot about this in Indian Country Today, about the record number of Native women who are running for office in the United States.
Yes, and just this week, history was made when Valerie Davidson became the lieutenant governor of Alaska, the first Native American woman to hold that office in any state in the country. She's Yupik. She's one of 4 other Native women running for lieutenant governor across the country. In fact, in Minnesota, no matter what happens, it'll be a Ojibwe woman who will be the next lieutenant governor of Minnesota, Red Lake Nation for the Republicans, and Donna Bergstrom, and Peggy Flanagan for the DFL in Minnesota. So, and she's White Earth Nation. So this idea is just this year, everything is just lit up. Candidates decided this was the time to run. Deb Haaland's a great example. Even though it's because of, she said in her announcement, because of Standing Rock and because of Donald Trump, there's also this long arc of she's been working at this for 20 years, and she's built a resume that's ready for this job. And that's part of the case in this story. If you look around the country, is there's so many women who are prepared, and this is the moment they chose to run.
So could you talk about the context? You said Trump being in office has something to do with it. But how is it that Native American women organized to run in this election?
Well, definitely the administration and its policies was a motivating force, particularly the policies against women. One of the great stories is how the Native American women candidates have created this network. Early on, I started writing about this. I used a hashtag #SheRepresents, and very soon after that, the fashion designer Bethany Yellowtail decided to make shirts called She Represents and list all of the Native American women running for office. They formed an informal network. They reach out to each other. They support each other. They help fundraise. Sharice Davids and Deb Haaland have campaigned together both in Kansas. Paulette Jordan was at Deb Haaland's campaign the night of the primary win and making calls for her and knocking on doors. The network they've created may be the most lasting institution out of this whole election.
Tara Houska, can you talk about what's happening in Minnesota? In Minnesota, you have a situation where no matter who wins, will be a Native American woman. We're talking about the state representative Penny Flanagan versus Republican Donna Bergstrom, both running for lieutenant governor.
Yeah, you know, that's been the frustrating part, I would say, about this whole Warren debacle and like the concept of Native identity being played out by 2 white folks, is that there is this historic, you know, representation of Native women running across the country. There's also, you know, the Indian Child Welfare Act coming under fire, and the very core of federal Indian law being put into question by that. There's the Bayou Bridge pipeline, and in Minnesota, where we're looking at, you know, 2 potential Native women that are going to hold the lieutenant governor's seat. You know, at the same time, we're looking at a, you know, massive resistance of Indigenous people that is building against the Line 3 project, Enbridge's Line 3 tar sands project. That's actually where I'm coming from today. So, you know, we're seeing this swell of
Tara.
Indigenous representation at the same time that we're trying to hold back the worst of what's happening.
Explain that. You're deeply involved with pipeline politics, whether we're talking about the Dakota Access Pipeline or whether we're talking about the current battle that you just mentioned.
Yeah, you know, I think that Native people, as people who are still very connected to the land, to the water, are, you know, taking these leadership roles in fights all over the country and all around the world. to protect the existing resources, to protect the existing water resources for us all. As we see the climate change raging around us, we're trying to protect the last of what's still remaining to us, and protect our communities and protect those around us for the next generation. So as that's happening, it's also in tandem with this rising up of women, and particularly women of color, into representation. But hopefully, we can get a good balance between the two, so we're able to all survive, as climate change is the greatest problem facing this world.
And Tara, how important is it that women were also leading the battle against the Dakota Access Pipeline and inspiring women? You're in North Dakota right now. I wanted to talk about the Supreme Court in North Dakota, and also Indigenous activists fighting a daily battle in the swampland of Louisiana against the Bayou Bridge pipeline, the 163-mile pipeline being built by Energy Transfer Partners, the same company behind DAPL. Water protectors have repeatedly been arrested for protesting and face felony charges under a harsh new anti-protest law signed by Louisiana's governor earlier this year. Pipeline construction scheduled to end before the new year.
I think that women, as we've seen with the Me Too movement really building, and we've seen the Women's March, and we've seen women being this backbone of so many different movement spaces, including, Indigenous resistance against these extractive industry projects. It's women taking on this role of, leadership that's sorely, sorely needed. It's women recognizing that missing and murdered Indigenous women is an epidemic across this country, across Canada. That these cases of women can be directly tied to the extractive industry. And also sitting here in North Dakota, where I know there's many women organizers rushing to try to get people home addresses so they can actually participate in the election. The very notion of Indigenous people not being able to participate in the election of a country that started after our nations existed. It's women taking on so many different roles, and I think it's something that is really, really needed in this time, this very critical time of potentially our very survival being called into question with the latest reports of what's happening and where we're at with climate change.
And Jesse Ross, could you also comment on that issue, the issue of voter ID laws that could potentially restrict the participation of Native Americans in the upcoming elections?
I think that, Tara, spoke about the germane part about it, which is that people are trying to be proactive. Tribes and individual Native organizers are trying to do the best that they can do with a bad situation where the Supreme Court, my mouth is dry, of the United States already passed and said that they're not going to weigh in substantively on this issue. Obviously, this is an issue that goes back to 2013 when this initial voter ID law was passed. And it's interesting, just as a historic matter, that the previous governor of the state of North Dakota said that there's never been any sort of voter fraud issue. This was something that was 100% the result of partisan politics. And I hate to make this about partisan politics, but this was the result of a Republican-controlled legislature with the intent of disenfranchising Native voters.
We want to thank you all for being with us. We're going to do part 2 of this discussion. We're going to post it under WebEx's online at democracynow.org. In Seattle, Jossie Ross, author, speaker, lawyer, storyteller, member of Blackfeet Nation, host of podcast Breakdances with Wolves. In Fargo, North Dakota, Tara Houskin, national campaign director for Honor the Earth, Ojibwe from the Cochiching First Nation. In Anchorage, Alaska, Mark Trahant, editor of Indian Country Today, member of the Shoshone-Bannock tribes. That does it for our show. I'll be speaking in Gainesville, Florida on Friday night and in Melbourne, Florida on Saturday night. Check our website at democracynow.org. Democracy Now! Is accepting applications for internships. Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Burke and Dina Guzder and Carla Wills and Tammy Warnoff and Sam Alcoff and Laura Gottesdiener, John Hamilton. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.